So what I'd like to talk to you about today is fractal electronic structures in Mott Metal-Insulator Materials. We have several collaborators on this work. I have had several PhD students involved in this. Ben Philibom, Shuo Liu, Yifan Wang, Forrest Simmons, and Cheyenne Boschek, along with my theory collaborator Karan Daman at University of Illinois. We have several experimental collaborators as well, including Mumtaz Kazalbash, Dmitry Bazov, Kirk Post, Alex McLeod, and a big team with them as well. And a different team led by Ricardo Kumen with Jaire Liu and Claudio Mazzoli, and ongoing work with scientists at ESPCI, Alexandre Zemera and Lionel Agui. So we often see in strongly correlated materials and in quantum materials, we often see intricate pattern formation when these materials are observed at the surface. So I'm showing here several for you, and I'll focus in on vanadium dioxide today. But I want to give you a sense of this. The issues that come up are actually very general to quantum materials. So I'll tell you today about vanadium dioxide as it goes through its metal insulator transition. But the thing to notice here is that there's a probe that's capable of measuring the surface that sees intricate pattern formation in the metal and insulator domains as the transition happens. Moving to the right here, this is scanning tunneling microscopy on a cuprate superconductor looking at stripe orientations, and you can see that sometimes the orientations go one way and sometimes they go another. There's pattern formation. This is a larger field of view on the right here out of Jennifer Hoffman's group, also scanning tunneling microscopy on a different cuprate superconductor, where the stripe orientations are color-coded red and blue and a larger field of view to highlight the intricate pattern formation that's can happen in these strongly correlated materials. Lower left here is neodymium nickelate. As it goes through its metal insulator transition, this is data from Dmitry Bazov's group using scanning near-field optical microscopy, and the metal insulator transition doesn't happen all at once. There's intricate pattern formation that happens as it is obtained. This is the closely related V2O3 studied by a different probe. And on the lower right is scanning tunneling microscopy out of Milan Allen's group in Leiden, studying the Mott and pseudogap puddles that happen in strontium iridates as they go through a phase transition. So there seems to be a theme of intricate pattern formation as phase transitions happen in certain quantum materials. I do think there's some universality going on across these materials, but today I'll focus in on the vanadium oxides. Now, in vanadium, in V2O3, chromium doped V2O3, there has been some work looking at criticality that comes up in the critical endpoint of the metal insulator transition. So if you consider the metal insulator transition like a first order phase transition from one phase to another, and then if you find that that first order transition has an end point around which you can proceed without going through the transition, then you have a critical endpoint. And this is work by Limelet and collaborators. Actually, the crystals were grown at Purdue University by Petty Metcalf and George Honeck. They studied then the conductivity of this material as it goes through its metal insulator transition, and they tried to get as close as they could to the critical endpoint. And so using a macroscopic transport probe, they argued that, in fact, they were seeing critical exponents based on the shape of these curves as you get close to the critical point. They were arguing that, in fact, they could detect the universality class of the transition, and they argued that it's the clean Ising universality class. That is, that interactions are important, but the disorder plays no role in this transition, even though it's a doped material. So option number one here that's been put in the literature is that perhaps these metal insulator transitions in Mott Metal-Insulator materials are all interaction dominated and disorder doesn't play a role. And then we have sort of the opposite claim in the literature. This is now a VO2 directly. This is work by Shironi et al. Looking at, again, transport. And here they're studying small regions, okay? So they're taking macroscopic transport, but on small samples. And of course, they see the large change in resistance as they go through the metal insulator transition. But when they zoom in and really study very carefully the resistance as a function of temperatures, they tune the temperature, they actually see discrete jumps. And what they saw was that the series of discrete jumps has some similarity as they go through the hysteresis loop multiple times. So by studying the height of these jumps and the statistics of that, they were able to conclude then, again, based on macroscopic transport, that, the universality class should be that of percolation, actually. The exponent they measured was percolation. Now, percolation is all disorder, but no interactions, all right? So how should we think about those two opposing claims? First of all, buyer beware about macroscopic transport measurements, trying to extract critical exponents, as our friend and colleague Philip Phillips reminds us. This is work with Eduardo Fradkin as well, and Papa Nicolau as lead author. Critical exponents, attempting to derive critical exponents from transport can actually be misleading, because if there's pattern formation going on inside and you attempt to measure macroscopically the transport, you're very, very sensitive to tiny, any tiny conducting path greatly shifts your results. And so because of that, the exponents can be very skewed when derived from macroscopic transport. So really, a much better method is to get spatial resolution if you can. Now, but just to remind you what happens at critical points, because critical points are very beautiful, as you know. A critical point being a point of continuous phase transition experiences fluctuations on all length scales. This, by the way, is simply a snapshot of an unmixing transition. This is two liquids mixed together in a test tube, and at high temperature they're miscible. As you lower the temperature, they become immiscible, and you get these lovely visual representations of critical fluctuations. Everywhere it's white inside is critical opalescence. And so within those white regions, you're seeing fluctuations on all length scales. What I like about this particular snapshot is you have a nice visualization of the correlation length. The correlation length is this distance of the white structure, and it's a correlated fluctuation event. It's fluctuating in time together, but there are fluctuations within all length scales beneath that correlation length. That's we discussed at the end of the last talk how to define a correlation length. That's one way to define it, is what's that length scale below which you have power law correlations. So no characteristic length scale. If you were to zoom in on the density here, it's actually fractal. And that is because there's no characteristic length scale, zooming in repeatedly will look the same and look the same and look the same until you hit the atomic scale. So the question that these experiments bring up is there a critical endpoint in vanadium dioxide that we could consider? And we believe there is one that's justified here. In the same way I showed you the Limillet article that had obtained a critical endpoint in V2O3 by chromium doping, if you take vanadium dioxide and add a dopant, you can get rid of the sharp metal insulator transition and get to kind of an indistinguishable phase. And in between, we argue there should be a critical point closing that coexistence region. So that's the critical point we're interested in identifying. In vanadium dioxide, what's the nature of that? And again, the competing claims in the literature are that it's all interactions and no disorder, or that it's all disorder and no interactions, but they were using macroscopic transport. So let me put a theoretical structure on this, since I am a theorist. Let's focus on, this is vanadium dioxide, and this is studying the metal insulator transition of vanadium dioxide using scanning near-field optical microscopy. This is data out of Dmitry Bazov's group with Mumtaz Kazalbash as first author. And our first theory step here is to simply identify domains, right? We have metal regions, which are green. We have insulating regions, which are blue. And we can simply associate a simple Ising variable with each of these. So let's call sigma equals +1, the metallic regions, sigma equals -1, the insulating regions. And it's natural if you're going to consider that there's some sort of interaction from one spot to another in the material, it's natural to expect that insulating patches would prefer to be near insulating patches. Metallic patches would prefer to be near metallic patches, so that they're influencing their neighbors that way. A patch of metal influences its neighbor to also be metallic. So that's encapsulated here in a ferromagnetic interaction between the Ising variables. And we model material disorder like a random field on those Ising variables. So you might imagine that material disorder in the sample could favor one particular phase over the other in various regions. So maybe here there's a disorder pattern back there that tends to favor metal, and maybe here there's a disorder pattern that tends to favor insulating. So that's encapsulated here. This local random field is taken out of a Gaussian distribution. We control what's called the disorder strength by controlling the width of that Gaussian. If you have an infinitely sharp Gaussian, there's no disorder. As you make the Gaussian broader, then you can get larger fluctuations in this tendency towards metallic or insulating. And that's encapsulated here in the random field term. So the model phase diagram we're working off of for these experiments is to consider that as the temperature is lowered in the experiment, it goes from metal to insulator. There is a coexistence region. And then if you could tune disorder, then with strong enough disorder, you would eventually close that coexistence region. So this is the critical point we're after. Now, we are modeling here. I will back up one slide. You can see the way that the random field comes in. In order to tune this model from metal to insulator, one would think of applying a net applied field, right? If the net applied field is all up, you would be all metallic. If the net applied field is all down, you would be all insulating. So we're making a mapping from the physical temperature of the experiment, here, denoted here. The physical temperature of the experiment would map to some combination of temperature in the model and field in the model, so that as you sweep the temperature from from high to low, you're effectively sweeping a net magnetic field from one side to the other and going through the metal insulator transition. And then our other control parameters, disorder. So there's several critical points that could come up in that structure. You could get uncorrelated percolation, as Sharoni and collaborators proposed. You could get the clean Ising model, as Limolette and collaborators proposed. Of course, you still have the question of whether it was 2D or 3D. You could also get a disordered Ising, a random field Ising fixed point out of this model. What we have studied here is to take advantage of the lovely spatial resolution available in these probes. Our previous speaker showed an example of tuning by temperature in order to get a critical exponent, right? The magnetization, the shape of that magnetization as it comes down in temperature gives you the critical exponent beta. Here, these spatially resolved probes offer a different way to get critical exponents out. Rather than tuning temperature or tuning magnetic field, you can, in a single shot, effectively think of your length scale as the tuning parameter that'll allow you to get a critical exponent out. There's tremendous information, spatial information available in these spatially resolved probes. And so that's the method that we have developed, is how to go from these very intricate images to a critical exponent. So one of the critical exponents that's natural with these spatially resolved probes is to think in terms of geometry, of course. One geometric measure is, of course, simply to identify metal and insulator clusters and to count how many you have of each size. That actually does give you a critical exponent if you have power law behavior. Another one that's very natural is to study the fractal dimensions of the clusters. So as you can see, this green cluster here, for example, isn't compact. It's not all green on the inside. There are regions inside of it that are blue. And its boundary is not compact. It has a rather intricate boundary. So we can encapsulate both of those geometric properties with a critical exponent. So here, for example, let's focus first on the volume fractal dimension. This would be, for example, we map each of these areas to a particular cluster. So green being metal. And so look at the structure of these clusters and count, for example, how many pixels are present in a cluster of a particular size. So, so that would be area here. So this is area on the horizontal axis. On the vertical axis, I have radius of gyration. So you could use any length scale measure you like. We are using radius of gyration, which is essentially like trying to find the center of mass of a cluster. It just gives you a linear, a measure of the linear size of the thing. And so this is a log-log plot of log of radius of gyration versus log of area. And you see that there are several points here that are lying on a line. A line on this point, of course, is power law behavior. And with about 2.5 decades of scaling here, perhaps 3 if you include that point, pretty confident that we can extract that critical exponent, okay? And here we've extracted it as 1 over the fractal dimension. We can also do something similar with the boundary or the hull. So the edge of this cluster is also fractal, it's not smooth. And so here we would simply count how many pixels are in the perimeter and plot to the log of the radius of gyration versus the log of the perimeter. That also allows us to get a critical exponent that's about the edge. Now, and I said as well, there are other exponents we can extract. This graph here focuses on comparing that data to the theoretical models I listed, just focusing on those fractal dimensions because they were the most discriminatory. I mentioned as well, counting how many clusters of a particular size. It turns out that all the theories predict the same number on it, and the experiment's pretty close to that, so it wasn't that informative. But these are the informative exponents here. What I have here is that the horizontal blue line is what came out of the data analysis on the previous page. So here, yes? Okay, so the volume fractal dimension is this line. The light blue is the error bar coming out of the data analysis. Same thing with the green. That's now the hull fractal dimension, and the width is the error bar. The circles are theoretical predictions taken out of the literature for a 2-dimensional cleanizing model, 2-dimensional percolation. So again, these were thin films that have some finite thickness, but ultimately at long length scales, one would expect 2-dimensional behavior. And so this would be the option of all interactions, but no disorder. This would be the option of all disorder, but no interactions. This would be the third option of both being prominent and being important, both interactions and disorder being prominent and important. And for the 3D case, I've drawn open circles here for the theory because we did a dimensional reduction based on what was known in the literature about those fractal dimensions. So this is the expectation then for dimensional reduction, right? Because these are, this data is taken on the surface. So the material seems to be consistent with a random field Ising model that's experiencing a drift in its exponents from the 3D case back to the 2-dimensional case. We say that because there's a finite thickness to the material. And you might imagine that as you look on small length scales, you're seeing three-dimensional behavior. But as you go to longer and longer length scales, it should tend towards the two-dimensional case. So characteristics of the model are that you expect broad hysteresis, you expect avalanches, as both of which have been observed. Predictions are that with data on larger fields of view, these data extracted exponents should tend towards the two-dimensional values. So we are collaborating with experimentalists now to try to get larger fields of view in order to test that. And the statistics of the avalanches, again, avalanches have been measured by Chironi by macroscopic measures. But as I mentioned before, it's been shown that those are skewed when you take a macroscopic measure. So we'd like to be getting these power law, well, the avalanche statistics to test whether they're power law out of larger fields of view with better time and temperature resolution. So we need larger fields of view, better time resolution. So that's ongoing experimental work with Alexandre Zimmer and Lionel Agui. I'm actually on sabbatical right now in Paris, visiting ESPCI, working with them on that. And our ongoing theoretical work includes a few things. We have developed a new exponent that is more discriminatory. And so we will also be applying that. We're applying machine learning and also working on calculating explicitly the surface critical behavior of these models. And I believe my time is almost up. So let me then conclude with this slide. What we see here is scale invariant clusters. There's something power law scale invariant going on here. The patterns are consistent with a combination of disorder and also interactions. You do expect in that model to have rather extreme critical slowing down. That's due simply to it being a random field. Ising model has very, very long equilibration times. It's known to be very difficult to equilibrate. Hysteresis is very natural in that kind of context. Some of our predictions include that adding more disorder to the system should broaden hysteresis, at least at first. Disorder also gives you another knob to control the material. There should be aging and coarsening going on. And since I'm out of time, I'll skip that and simply end here. So thank you for your time, and